the beginning of the Bible, we get two stories that are not so much about how God creates the world, but about what kind of world God creates and what kind of God creates the world. We get two pictures in there of what kind of place we're in and how we are to live. We get one picture of creation as a nest, a spirit of God hovering over the waters as a bird would hover over a nest. And God almost seems to build a sort of nest, outer to inner, filling it up, and then creating humans to reign over it in chapter 1. And in chapter 2, we get a picture of God planting a garden, and then eventually planting human beings within that garden. Now, neither story begins with human beings, but both are perfect images for God's desire for human beings, which is blessing. Not so much as giving us a bunch of pleasurable things, but creating an environment for the flourishing of our whole selves and for humanity as a whole. God creates an external environment, and from that we can glean that it matters where we are. The environment that we are in, the culture, the family, all of it shapes us and shapes how we see the world and shapes the patterns by which we learn to live in the world. Now, a lot of this may seem obvious, but it can fly in the face of Western ideas and ideals that we are and should be independent, not just of human tyranny, but of being affected by anything. There is this belief in our culture that anyone can flourish regardless of their environment. We have a whole mythology around people in grave circumstances breaking through to success, even if those stories distort the overall reality of the human condition and our social settings. But let's just say this for now, because we could spend a lot more time on that. God understands that our environment matters, and so God builds it. God plants it. God tends the creation around us. And then God gives us work. And the work, our work as human beings, our core calling in the scriptures, whether we're talking about Genesis 1 and the nest or Genesis 2 and the garden, our core calling is to tend that environment, to make it as conducive as possible to the flourishing of all life. And that, my friends, is what we call justice. Now, there are lots of ways we could define justice, lots of ways that the word is used. We can define justice narrowly as a kind of antithetical dimension to grace, right? So people get what they deserve. Sometimes we use that when we say, oh, we want justice for this or that. What we mean is we want the person who hurt us or someone else to be punished, to get what they deserve. There's another definition of justice that just is really the same as equality, treating everyone the same without attention to our different needs and cultures and wirings and gifts. I think a more biblical definition of justice, though, is creating and cultivating an environment where God's gracious blessings can abound. The nest where vulnerable eggs and baby birds can be nurtured, a garden where all varieties of plants can flourish and bear fruit. That is a biblical picture of justice. And so just as the person who's living this blessed to be a blessing life that we've been talking about all fall is someone who's wholehearted and can show up as our authentic and honest selves, and they're community minded, they enter into the crucible and the mixing bowl of community where we can grow in love and see it flourish, so that person is justice oriented. This is the third and final characteristic or fruit of that blessed to be a blessing person, justice oriented. The work of justice is shaping the environments around us to make them more conducive to human flourishing. Now, that's easier said than done. And so we're going to get some help from the Apostle Paul, and we're going to stay in Colossians 3. We've almost been moving backwards in it. Today, I'm going to read verses 1 through 11, though we're going to be focusing more on verses 5 through 11. Paul writes, "So, if you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. And when Christ, who is your life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. I can't wait to talk more about that text in the coming weeks. Put to death, therefore, whatever in you is earthly: fornication, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming on those who are disobedient. These are the ways you also once followed when you were living that life. But now you must get rid of all such things: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive language from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have stripped off the old self with its practices, and have clothed yourselves with the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge according to the image of its Creator. In that renewal there is no longer Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave and free, but Christ is all and in all. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now there are three truths, I think, that we can glean from this text that relate to our work of justice. And the first one is that external justice work, making the world a more just place, requires searing and difficult inner work. We've been talking about this for the last few weeks, whether it has to do with being wholehearted or community-minded, but this relates to justice as well. Because before those beautiful exhortations of verses 12 through 14 that we read last week about being compassionate and humble and vulnerable and forgiving, we have this command: put to death, therefore, those things, whatever in you is earthly. It's kind of, if we're looking at the image of the garden, it's this reality that for anything good to grow, we need to clear the ground and till the soil before we can plant. And it says, put to death, therefore. And what are we to put to death in justice work? Not the bad guys, the parts of us. And that's the word, literally, the parts of us, or the members of our bodies, the members of ourselves, that are shaped more by fear and self-interest than the pattern of Christ. So we could look into that earthly word more, and maybe we'll do so a little bit next week, but that's what the idea is. There are parts of ourselves that are shaped by kind of those animal instincts of fight or flight. And we want to move away from those to a more Christ-like way of engaging in the world. And this requires judgment. Judgment and justice are connected words. But judgment, again, is one of these words we need to let the Bible define a little better for us. Judgment in the scriptures is really about the exposure and exorcism of that which is opposed to the life-giving purposes of God. It's not about just punishing people for doing bad things. It's about bringing to light the sin and evil and corruption that is there. It's the allowance of those inward dispositions in us to be seen outwardly, for the fruits of the tree to reveal the corruption of the roots. So there are all kinds of really just natural and normal ways that we can see judgment happening around us. Sometimes it is the revelation of a hurtful action. And we have had so much of this in our society recently. It's been a judgment. It's been a time of judgment for our society. As brave person after brave person comes forward and says, this person hurt me. And so often we keep those things in shame and fear, but we've had people, whether it's the Me Too movement, whether it's people of color talking about their own experiences, or Jewish people talking about their experiences, we've had people just revealing the ways that they have been hurt, and these undertones of misogyny or racism or whatever the case is that go on in our society. And that's judgment. That's a judgment on those evil realities. Sometimes judgment can look like, and maybe this has happened to you, that burst of anger in public, or that burst of something that we normally just try and restrain in ourselves, but all of a sudden something happens and it comes out in public. That's a form of judgment. That's when people see something that's true about what's going on in us, and it can be really embarrassing. But it's also just honest. We can see judgment in the effects of climate change. It's bringing to light, as scientists study the numbers and the temperatures and what's happening at the ice in the Arctic and so on, as we're seeing those things and measuring those things, that's an exposure of the results of how we as human beings have lived and consumed and abused the planet for generations. That's a form of judgment. Sometimes judgment just looks like, and we hear these stories a lot, but the internal emptiness that many people feel in the face of their own wealth and success. And it's the realization, it's the exposure of this, wow, all these things I have been chasing after really don't satisfy at all. That's a form of judgment. All of these things, all of the evils and corruptions and idolatries of our hearts will eventually come to light when the self and the immediate fulfillment of my desires is centered. That's what idolatry is. And the words that Paul uses to describe these earthly parts of us that need to be put off or put to death: fornication, impurity, passions, evil desire, and greed, which is idolatry. And this is not just about, this isn't about sex, it's not about money, it's not about these things that are just part of our society. This is a posture towards the world that Paul is describing, of consuming and commodifying and devouring in hopes that my desires will be fulfilled, that I will somehow be satisfied. As the Rolling Stones sang, though, they have all these things and they still sing, I can't get no satisfaction, right? Like that is judgment. And that's what needs to be put off. When we realize, wow, these things aren't satisfying, we put those off and we say, okay, there's other things to pursue. Only God can fill us. Only God can satisfy us. And when we pursue things other than God, hoping that they will satisfy us, it creates a kind of vortex that sucks in my own soul and deteriorates it. And it sucks in those around me and the people I use and the planet that I use to try and fill that thing that only God can fill. And these things must be exposed, because God's intent is always to bless, but sometimes it doesn't feel warm and fuzzy. Sometimes it's like, the Al Gore documentary, an inconvenient truth. Sometimes judgment is just the facing us with that inconvenient truth that the things that I am living my life about, the things that I'm pursuing, the things that I've designed the structures of my life around, they're not God and they're not fulfilling me. Too often for us, justice work starts with figuring out how to change them, how to expose their evil and greed. But wholehearted, community-minded, blessed to be a blessing person understands that justice is an inside-out work. And yes, it will involve exposing inconvenient truths in the world that disrupt others and make waves and get people mad at us. But what we see, we know, this is what we have to know. What we see in the big systems and structures and institutions and societies that is evil and corrupt is what happens when the fears and disordered desires of our own hearts come together and begin to take on a spiritual and structural life of their own. The flip side then is when we learn to navigate the messy systems within us, we are better able to speak into the messy systems around us. And the bonus is that we can do so from a place of humility and compassion. We know how we work. It's not us versus them, it's just us for us. And we know the things out here are reflections of the things in here. And so we come at justice from this place, putting off all of these other things from a place of compassion and humility. Now, 2 side notes about this point that are hopefully going to be quick. This inner work especially applies to those of us who have some level of power or privilege or prosperity in our society. Because we are taught to see these things as blessings from God and maybe even things that entitle us to speak from a place of authority. But according to the Beatitudes, so, blessed are the poor in spirit and those who mourn and the vulnerable, and according to the prophets and the whole scriptural testimony, these things, power, privilege, and prosperity, might actually mean we have to actually dig through a couple extra layers to get to the humility and compassion that we need to do this justice work. Second note is that this very much applies. This inner work not only applies to us as individuals, but it also applies to all the us's, including our church bodies, as we seek justice for the world. We need to be just as rigorous or more about the environments that we are creating amongst ourselves as Christians as we are about the environments we hope to transform in our societies. Right now, we are seeing how devastating it is to our ability as the church to speak to our society words of wisdom and justice when we have allowed things like sexual abuse and narcissism and greed and racism and more to fester in our churches. The irony is we often try to kind of cover up those warts and wounds in our churches because we're afraid that if we show those things to the world, we'll lose respect, we'll lose our voice. But all ironically, in the end, it's these very things, the more we cover them up, that become sinkholes in our church that consume the church's witness in the world. And there are so many people in our society right now who are saying, church, you have nothing to say to me because you're not practicing what you are preaching. You're not doing the inner work. You're not creating the environment even inside of you that you're trying to tell us we should have outside. And we've really suffered. Our witness has suffered in society because of those things. All right, second point. Justice work is energized by imagination and possibility. Now, verse 8 basically describes what energizes much of our justice work in our society today. And it's not imagination and possibility. Paul says, "But now you must get rid of all such things: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive language from your mouth. Do not lie to one another." And friends, this is just our society right now, isn't it? Let's just go through these. Wrath and anger. We often enter the conversation of justice angry. Now, anger is often a right and valid response to injustice. Whether we are the victims or whether we're bearing witness to the victimization of others, it's not that we shouldn't be angry. But often, and we've talked about this before, often because we haven't wanted to do the inner work of grief and loss, what happens is that instead of really seeking justice, we're just projecting our own discomfort with a changing world outward in anger and not really focusing on a true vision of justice. And this is so essential for us to sort through all of this stuff in us, the anger and the loss and the grief and the joy and the hope. All of these, we need to sort through those so that our anger can be focused and we can enter into the public dialogue not as avengers of my own wrath and hurt, but as fellow human beings seeking to bring greater blessing to the world. Malice and slander. And these are how we other our perceived opponents. We make other human beings into demons and beasts, honestly. And what happens is justice work becomes less about building a better world and more about defeating the bad guys. And slander is one of the ways we do this. I've had so many conversations around issues of justice, and I'm talking to someone and they start saying things about their opponents. And I think, have you ever even talked to someone who believes that thing, who believes differently from you? Have you ever really had a conversation with them? Because I don't know anyone. I know people kind of on that side, but I don't know anyone who thinks like that or believes that. I remember when we were in Illinois years ago, and it was election season and all the commercials were on, and I was probably like not paying attention until one of these commercials came on, and I just heard the line. It was an attack ad, and it said, "So-and-so hates kids." And I just like looked up and I was like, what? What they were saying was ultimately like they didn't agree with this person's approach to educational policy, but instead they were like, this person hates kids. And I was like, really? Or, you hear this in conversations about Black Lives Matter or critical race theory now. People who are trying to lift up issues of racism, and people are like, oh, they're all communists. And I'm like, that's not my experience of them. Or, you might hear people say, well, Republicans are all racist idiots. And I'm like, no, I know Republicans, and that's not my experience of them. And so when we enter in anger, our strategy becomes to demonize the other and move towards destruction instead of listening and creating. Abusive language, need I say more? That abusive language is justified when we demonize in other people. The less human they are to us, the more we feel justified in just saying whatever we want about them. And then lying. Do not lie to one another. And what happens is when we are so into a cause or a tribe, oftentimes truth takes a back seat, right? We only check the facts of our opponent's arguments, not our own. We pass along falsehoods. We shove our own personal and tribal skeletons into the closet. We sacrifice both truth and love for the sake of our cause. And so now the earthly parts of ourselves are now imaged as an old self that Paul tells us to put away. He says that that's one way of living from our self-interest and self-righteousness. And there's another way. Now, before I used the word exorcise, not exercise, exorcise. And I think this word feels maybe passé or antiquated. We haven't really, unless we've seen The Exorcist or the Emily Rose movie, whatever, we don't really think about the exorcism of demons or anything like that. But as I thought about it this week, I thought this could be maybe a more healthy way to think about justice work than what we often do. Because when Jesus sees people who are living in ways that are destructive to themselves and others, Jesus exorcises their demons. He doesn't destroy the human being. What Jesus does is he recognizes, okay, that's a demon. That's not the whole of who this person is. So I'm going to focus on calling out the worst in them and casting it away. And then the human being is left to grow. And I think that's a far healthier way of looking at it than what we do today. Now, there are unhealthy ways where, everyone I disagree with has a demon, right? Like, that's not the issue. But so often what we do is we just condemn the whole person. And justice work becomes about like doing surgery with a plumbing wrench. But Jesus exorcises the spiritual corruption from a person so that they and those around them can flourish. And so, this is what Paul is saying. Put away the old self. Put to death those members in you that are just bringing hurt to you and others. Expose the old self, not so we can say, ha, gotcha, you were wrong and I was right. No, but so that we can put it aside and begin to draw out the new self. Because there is a new self. He says in verse 10, put off the old self with its practices, and you have clothed yourselves with the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge according to the image of its creator. There is a new self. There is a new way of thinking and being shaped by our creator. And I think it's so interesting that Paul uses that phrase. He could have said, being renewed according to the image of God, and that would have been fine. But he uses the term creator. And I think this is what often gets lost in justice work when we enter it angry and when we're just about winning, is when it's about destroying the other person, what gets lost is all creativity. Justice work is not just energized by the exorcism of the evil, but by the new possibilities that are now opened up. Jesus doesn't want to just get rid of people's demons. Jesus wants that person to live a full and healthy and abundant life that's blessed by God. And so Paul takes us back to the image of the Creator. Remember, the one who built the nest, who cultivated the garden for the flourishing of human beings. This is what our minds are being renewed to do, is to see, the possibilities of if we can build a better environment for people, how they can flourish and grow. This is justice work, and it's creativity. Walter Brueggemann calls it the prophetic imagination. And he contrasts it to the systems that we know, the ways it always has been, the ways we're told it has to be. And he says, if we think about justice as just people getting what they deserve, we will be focused on punishment and destruction. But if we learn a more robust biblical vision of justice, it will be energized by the Creator God, the Spirit that hovers over oppressive chaos, and the Word that speaks a new light. And that's a far better energy for the work of justice. Third, and finally, the work of justice is essentially the relinquishment of individual and tribal loyalties for the sake of human flourishing. This is a flourish of imagination at the end of this section where Paul writes, in that renewal, there is no longer Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave and free, but Christ is all and in all. And those words might be foreign to us, but for us, it might be something like there is no longer Christian and Jew and Muslim. There is no longer Republican and Democrat. There is no longer American and Chinese and Iranian. But Christ is all and in all. It's that kind of imagination that feels so foreign to how we see the world and what we know. Paul is imagining and envisioning a world where human beings are working at co-restoring and co-creating with God an environment for the flourishing of all human beings, where we are doing justice. So often the way that we approach justice work is the very thing that justice work needs to exorcise, right? If justice work is seen as accusing, condemning, and destroying the bad guys, the them, well, we're missing out on who the enemy really is. Justice work wants us to get rid of the accusing and condemning and destroying, because this text imagines another way. This text is okay, real quick. This text is not about suggesting that there is just one basic way of being Christian, and every person and church should do things in precisely the same way. Right? And this is sometimes what happens. Every church assumes that their way is the basic Christian way, and everyone else just needs to throw off their cultural distinctives and labels and be like us. Now, this is not about saying that there's one Christian way that somehow isn't shaped by all of these different cultures, Jew and Greek and slave and free and circumcised and uncircumcised. That's not the point here. Every expression of Christianity, every expression of church is shaped by our cultures, by the families we grew up in, by the language we speak, by just the ideas and the stories that we've heard growing up. Jesus wasn't just this general basic human. He was a first century Palestinian Jewish man. And so this is not just saying none of those, throw away everything and just be one basic kind of Christian or one basic kind of human. No, this is about casting aside the ways we use our cultural distinctives as sources of superiority and bring them to compete with other cultures for that superiority or for resources or power. We've learned that the solution to racism isn't being colorblind, pretending that there is no race. Instead, it's finding the beauty in other cultures that our own cultures may be blinding us to, and finding ways of bringing our best together for each other instead of in competition against one another. It means letting people who are seeing Jesus and church and culture from a different angle show us things that we couldn't see, and teach us things that we wouldn't have noticed without their way of seeing. And this happens with the relinquishment of our tribal and cultural and familial loyalties, not our tribal and cultural and familial gifts and blessings and wisdom. And so this requires a whole new imagination about ourselves and who we are as human beings, shaped by various cultures and environments. Willie James Jennings has an exceedingly brilliant book that does in 300 pages, so much better than what I'm trying to do in 300 words, which is make sure we don't mistake one experience of Christianity for the experience of Christianity. And his book title is The Christian Imagination. For many of us, the work of justice, it turns out, will not only bless the poor and oppressed, it will also liberate our own minds and hearts and bodies and souls to know Christ and see the church with dimensions and abundance we never before thought possible. But that only happens when we learn to relinquish our way of being Christian and embrace a variety of angles and perspectives on who Jesus is and what the church is. So the work then is to learn what in us belongs to the old self and what is uniquely ours to bring into the new creation as a gift to God and to the world. And this is a challenge. Being justice-oriented is as much about knowing who we are, what we bring, and how we see the world and where we are being called than it is just trying to play whack-a-mole with the things in the world that make us uncomfortable or trying to solve all the world's problems. It requires the inner work. It requires us to draw on the energy of imagination and possibility rather than destruction and anger. It requires us to relinquish our tribal loyalties and receive the vision of God's kingdom. I hope you've seen that at the core of all of this, the call to justice is deeply intertwined in creation, in the prophetic witness, in the incarnation of Jesus, and in the hope of Pentecost. It's to be like God in shaping and tending environments for the flourishing of diverse people with diverse blessings to share. It is to listen for Christ's word whispering through the groans of creation and the cries of the oppressed and even the yearnings of our own bodies and souls. Like Emma Lazarus's huddled masses yearning to breathe free. All creation, inside out, is crying out for freedom, for liberation, for the opportunity to flourish with all God's glory and goodness. And their cries will be heard. Your cries will be heard. They are heard. There is a nest and a garden prepared for us. May we do our part to build and cultivate these environments so that all can come and find the abundant blessings of life in Christ. Amen. Now, if you want to stick around, we're going to do a little justice activity. And this is based on two things. One, it's based on the Jewish tradition of tikkun olam, which is the idea that the human is here for the healing of the world. It means the healing of the world. And we're going to start there, and then we're going to be influenced by a pastor named Bruce Reyes Chow and some of the ways he talks about finding our place in the work of justice. And so at any point you can pause the video. You might want to spend some more time reflecting on a question, because these are big questions that might take all week or months to explore. And so please feel free to do that. And so I'm just going to kind of walk through this meditation, trusting that you will take the time as you need it. All right, so we begin with the idea of tikkun olam, that as human beings, we are here to bring healing and repair to the world. And so in this moment, contemplate, go deep inside of you and ask, what is one thing that stirs you about the world? You might ask the question, who is in need of a nest or a garden that is more hospitable to their flourishing? And when you see them struggling, something inside you is moved. Now, what is something in you? It could be the things Paul mentions in these verses we've looked at. What is something in you, or one tribal loyalty, that keeps you from joining in the work of tikkun olam in a healthy, imaginative, creative way? Now take a moment and ask God and pray for your own healing, for tikkun olam to take root in you. Pray that God would help you to put off the old self and put to death those members in you that are opposed to the purposes of God, that are keeping you from that flourishing and justice. Pray that God would expose what is in you that needs to be exorcised, and that Jesus would speak those words, come out from you. And now as we think about what's going on inside of us, what's stirring in us, what maybe the issues are that move us and make us want to do something, let's take a moment to imagine what your participation in this work towards justice might involve. And Bruce Reyes Chow gives us a paradigm of 4 different roles that we might take, all necessary, but not all necessarily for us to take on. So maybe pick one of these 4 roles and say, this is how I can contribute to this cause and to this work. The first role is the prophet. The prophet is the activist who speaks truth and exposes what is unhealthy and harmful and calls people to something higher. Is that you? Are you called to be the prophet in this moment? The second is the priest. The priest is the academic who tells the story and the history of an injustice, who shows us how we got here, what's under the surface, and develops ideas and plans for a path to greater justice in the world. In what ways do you connect with the role of the priest? Third is the pastor. The pastor is the amalgamator, the one who ministers to people's hearts, who reassures people who are uncomfortable with this work that there is something better, that there is a hope here. The person who draws people together in the love and goodness that ground this work, that remind people that this is for them, that this is for the good of all of us. And the fourth is the poet. The poet is the artist who shocks our complacency by putting images and stories in front of us in ways that engage our hearts and that stimulate our imagination through our senses. Which one of these roles do you see for yourself? How has God gifted you and wired you and equipped you and prepared you for this moment? The prophet, the priest, the pastor, the poet? And who can join you in this work? Who else is engaged in this work, perhaps in another way? Perhaps you feel the pastor in yourself, but you realize there's prophets out there that you need to do that work. There's poets out there. There's priests out there that you need to join in, not in opposition, but in a multi-fronted work towards justice. And then finally, share what God is doing in you with someone else. It could be me. It could be a friend. It could be someone else in your church. It could be someone else you know shares your passion. And maybe in that conversation, something emerges. Your work, your calling, your vocation becomes a little more clear, and you begin to take action. Now let's just close with praying that God would guide us, that God would heal us, that God would energize us, and that God would bear fruit through us so that we might have a more just world, more conducive to the flourishing of all and to the receiving and sharing of God's blessings.